helping you lead a healthier life. This is CURES.
Welcome to the CURES Show, where we explore the cutting edge of wellness for our mind, body, and spirit. I'm Kara Sundlin. If you're a parent, you've likely lost it and regretted getting angry with your kids. And I'm sure you have seen your kids get angry at you. So what's the deal with anger? Well, it's actually a normal human emotion. It gets a pretty bad rap, though. That's why I've asked child psychologist Dr. Laura Saunders to help us out so we can learn more about anger and how we can deal with it in a healthy way. Welcome, Dr. Saunders.
Thank you for having me, Kara.
So as a child psychologist, I got to assume, did they have lots of courses on anger? Like, kids get angry a lot, right?
Yes, but I mean, I like to remind people that anger is a functional emotion. It's sort of something in our emotional spectrum, but often anger is a cover for something deeper. But we're going to talk about anger today. We can get a little bit at, what's underneath it, because that's really what also has to be addressed. When you're working with someone, or you have a child, or you have a sibling or someone in your life who has what I'd call a more chronic anger problem, there's underlying issues that aren't being addressed. But I do want to deal with some of the conventional wisdom on how to manage anger.
Yeah, so a lot of times we've heard, go ahead, just vent. And you say we kind of need to take a second look at venting to deal with anger.
So there was a study done by Ohio State. It's called a meta-analysis. So they look at usually hundreds of studies in a meta-analysis. And what's interesting is that the conventional wisdom is that if you're angry, you should vent your anger, right? It's how those rage rooms, where people go in and they throw dishes and they break things and they rip newspapers or magazines, like they really accentuate and focus on their rage. That's what prompted some of the research. But what some of the research found is actually that those kind of settings overall increase your anger. They don't decrease it.
Really? So basically, when we're venting, whether we be in a rage room or just, at home stomping our feet and banging our fists on something, hopefully in a contained area, that venting, that letting off steam, it doesn't really help with anger?
So the way that they categorized it, and I really like this, is activities that increase your arousal versus activities that decrease your arousal. So arousal it's kind of like emotional energy. And so things that you're doing that increase your arousal. So, if you're at one of those settings where you're stomping your feet or punching your pillow or, yelling at someone or doing something that increases your kind of negative emotion, your arousal, really are not as effective as activities that decrease your arousal.
So the next time we're feeling really angry or frustrated, and if we're hopefully thinking, how do I not take this out on someone, what should we do?
So it's important to remember that venting really goes beyond just sharing, right? I mean, there are things that we need to do to kind of release our emotions. I'm not asking people to bottle things up. And, we do also need to address sort of what's underneath the anger, especially when it's an ongoing pattern. But what this research really found is that activities that decrease arousal are far more effective to actually help your anger dissipate. So it's things like deep breathing and yoga and meditation. It could be walking. It could be doing something that's going to overall decrease your arousal. Think, punching pillows or punching walls or screaming into, a bag or whatever people might do, increases your arousal and therefore may cause you to ruminate or think over and over again about what it is that made you angry in the first place, or bring up other things that have made you angry in the past.
Wow, okay, so even going for a run, according to this study, hey, if it works for you, fine, but even going for a run may not be the best thing because running actually increases our arousal.
Right. Activities that increase our arousal can help us hold on to anger. And yes, everything is always individualized. If you're someone where you've had a really difficult and frustrating day and going for a run is a release for you, it's a way for you to kind of think and release things, I think what gets concerning is the difference between releasing things and then ruminating, right? Ruminating is that process whereby we think these negative thoughts over and over and over and over again, and it really serves to get us more worked up. So if you can do an activity that decreases rumination and increases sort of the release, that's really what we're looking for.
So let's go back to the kids. Let's say you're noticing extreme anger in your kids, that on most days they're having a meltdown and getting really angry. What causes that, and how do we deal with that?
In situations like that, we're really looking for patterns. And as I say all the time, parents know their kids, right? You know which of your children tends to be more kind of hold on to anger and frustration and then, explode at the end of the day. It's those kids that hold on to whatever the things that make them angry or frustrating things that happen during the day. They're okay on the bus. They get off the bus and they get into their parents' car, and then boom, they just kind of explode and release their anger. So looking for patterns of behavior, knowing what sort of situations tend to trigger anger. I honestly think the worst thing you can tell someone is calm down. I don't think anyone's ever calmed down or released their anger by just having someone say calm down. You'd get much further with validating how someone feels. I can understand why that would make you angry, or I could understand what was so frustrating about that situation. So validation's far more effective than telling someone just to calm down.
Yeah, and I think even as adults, right, we notice the kids might have short fuses. That's what we've kind of called it, right? And I can be one of those people, right? And then there's people who have long fuses. And I'll look at like my mom and my dad. I'm like, well, they all had short fuses. So people who can we got to have our things in our toolbox, obviously. But is it just our personality, our genetics of like people who get angry easier versus people who just don't ever seem to get ruffled?
Yeah, I do think there are some temperamental differences, right? So in kids we call it temperament. It's usually in adolescents that we call it more adolescents and adults we call it personality. But there are definitely temperamental differences in terms of how you manage frustration, how you tolerate distress. I don't want to get off on a tangent about ADHD, but we know that kids who have attentional disorders have lower frustration tolerance, have less impulse control. It's difficult for them to tolerate distress because they don't have the tools to manage it. So a lot of times we see those young people really kind of get worked up very easy. But that sense of patience is very different in kids.
Yeah. So calm down doesn't work. If we were in your office and you were giving us a script of how we deal with an angry child or maybe an angry adult in our life, what would we do instead? What does it look like?
So I look at anger like a bell curve, right? So like it's a kind of curves up and curves down. So I like to remind parents that none of us, when we're at the peak of our anger or arousal, calming down, and honestly, even deep breathing when you're at the peak of your arousal may not be that effective. It's knowing that it's this bell curve and knowing that there's a series of steps that lead up to the height of your anger. And the most effective strategies to help you decrease your arousal are early in those stages before you get to the peak, right? When you're in absolute full rage, you're not necessarily going to engage in deep breathing, right? It's not effective then. But to really start to identify what are the triggers, what are the steps, what are the buttons that get pushed that lead you up there, because then you can kind of thwart. I always think of things on a curve, right? Then you can kind of thwart that peak, and it's much, much easier for everyone to manage.
Okay. And if you've gotten past that point, what should we do? Because we know saying calm down isn't the right thing. So let's say your child is really melting down, getting very angry, sometimes saying really triggering things to you. And I'm sure the worst thing to do is get angry back, but that's hard. So what do we do instead?
Well, you bring up a good point, because I think in those situations, what I don't want parents to do is personalize it, right? Because that anger, or if you have a child that's more prone to displaying anger, it does have some temperamental factors that that can be addressed. But it's not to personalize it. Usually getting angry back in that situation just escalates the situation further. There's nothing worse than a child yelling and then the parent yelling. It just escalates the situation. It doesn't de-escalate the situation. But, you know, making sure you're based on age, making sure your child's in a safe place. You know, for right now, if they're in the height of their anger, they might need to just cry or release it. You know, strategies work best when you can be in a much calmer state and talk about what made you so angry or what made you so upset or what made you so frustrated, whatever words you know you and your child want to use, and then talk about how to deflect it the next time. But there's no problem solving that happens when you're at the height of your emotional arousal in a tantrum or rage or whatever word you want to use.
Do we start using empathy then? I see you're very angry. Do we say, try to model if we're in our best part? Well, I see you're really angry. I'm going to come back after we can talk about this in a more calm way. Like, what would be in our best self, what would we do?
In our best self, which we try to be every day, in our best self, it really is. It's like, I'm going to give you some space right now, or let me know when you're ready to talk, or, you know, I understand you're really upset, but I need you to be safe. You know, can you please continue this in your own room, and whatever it is, because you want to contain it. You want to, it's not the time for problem solving, but a little bit of validation goes a long way. I'm sorry you're so angry. Clearly I did something that made you upset. I don't even know what it is. We can talk about it later. I'm going to take some space, you know, so doing something to remove yourself as the parent or adult can be very helpful. But it really is in your best interest as the parent in that situation, or as the adult or caregiver, to keep yourself on a more emotional level playing field, because it helps you think more clearly.
Yeah, and so choosing that empathy versus, according to these studies, venting or letting your kid, hey, just vent, is maybe not the right thing, according to these studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes when they're, again, at the height of their arousal or the height of their rage, you're not necessarily going to circumvent it at that time, but you don't want them to do anything to increase it. So if they're really, really upset and kind of having a tantrum, you're not going to give them a pillow to smash it against the floor, because that's just going to make it worse. So helping them find a way to contain it. Obviously, safety is always paramount, but allowing them their own process to de-escalate. You know, I do like to say things, you know, is there anything I can do to help you right now? Obviously, I've been with young people many times because I worked on an inpatient unit. So I used to see a lot of huge, absolutely huge tantrums. And so really, I think the critical piece that you've mentioned is keeping yourself in control. Sometimes in those situations, all I would do is I would just breathe deeply as a way to kind of model that I'm slowing down my breathing. I'm staying here for you. You're not ready to talk yet, and just kind of model your own deep breathing and your own sense of self-control as a way to better manage the situation. But you can't necessarily interfere with someone. They've got to kind of come down the other side of that bell curve of emotional arousal.
I like the visual of the bell curve. Maybe that's something we could draw with our kids. I've also heard, you know, and this may be popular culture, I wonder if there's any truth from you as a psychologist, that most of our feelings, if we just allow ourselves to feel them, will run their course in about 90 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've said here before, move a muscle, change a mood, right? You know, feelings don't last forever. So they have time limits. And that goes for happiness too, right? So, you know, you're ecstatically happy about something, you have to have the expectation that you're not going to remain in that state. So yes, sometimes it's just tolerating it, or learning how to move through it, or allowing your child to express themselves. Sometimes when you're at the height of arousal, your ability to think clearly and express yourself is very limited. So I don't usually engage in any kind of processing during those. If it's a tantrum or a rage episode, I don't engage in processing during that. And that actually comes sort of on the backside, when they have maybe a little bit of insight about what made them so angry or so frustrated, and then they're a little bit more open. Often you see that vulnerability on the downside of the emotional arousal curve.
Okay. So teaching our kids to learn words for their emotions can really help, and even teaching them that, hey, this is a curve, it's not going to last forever. The more they understand that it's not the end of the world and they're really not going to stay that way, it can really help.
Yes, and I think one of the things that we as adults have that our children and our teens don't have is we have perspective, right? So we have life experiences that tell us, yes, there was that time I felt so enraged, but I was able to do some things to help myself feel better, right? We have that hindsight, that 20/20 vision. But often your teens, when they're in the moment, and sometimes they believe that moment will last. And so, just making sure they're safe, making sure nothing bad's going to happen. I certainly don't want them destroying anything, definitely not hurting themselves, but allowing them to experience their emotion, being there to sort of bear witness and to problem solve when necessary, but allow them to experience it and kind of come down the other side of the emotional arousal curve.
So let's talk about, again, you said anger, we really shouldn't think of it as an emotion. It's more of a boundary. It's more of an iceberg. There's something underneath it. So for kids who are getting angry every day, and let's just use the morning, for example. A lot of kids get under pressure in the morning where they're, I forgot this, I forgot that. And before you know it, they're screaming. Everyone's screaming. So I guess if you go back, the trigger is there's not enough time or something. But what do you do when there's this habit of the same angry outburst that gets so frustrating?
Right. So that's a good point, because those situations, what you're looking for is patterns of behavior. Obviously, as psychologists, that's what we look for all the time. But that's really what parents have to do a lot of, right? They have to look for patterns. And so in that example that you just used, like the morning routine, what I get concerned about is where's the skill deficit. So in that situation that you described, the skill deficit might be organization. The skill deficit might be, ability to manage each step or tolerate transitions. I think parents sometimes forget that, a morning routine is not just like being at home and getting to school. A morning routine is filled with a half dozen or more transitions, right? You're in bed to out of bed. You're out of bed to your pajamas off to your clothes on, your clothes on in your bedroom to clothes on in the kitchen, to, getting a bite to eat, to getting, right? There's all these little micro transitions. And if you have a child that's more disorganized, and those transitions are very difficult, or their ability to sort of flow from one step to another without support and guidance is really difficult, then as a parent, when you notice that pattern, you really do want to step in and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. For younger kids, we're going to have flashcards in the morning. I don't even need to talk to you. When I flash the yellow card, this is what we're going to do. When I flash the blue card, this is what we're going to do. I mean, there's different strategies that you can use if words tend to be more triggering for someone's anger.
Okay. And obviously when you're talking about teenagers, you want them to get a little more independent, and there's pressure on everybody, right? Because someone's late and that's causing someone else to be late, and then the other siblings getting mad because maybe they're on time. But you bring up a good point. It starts the night before with organizing and things like that. But at what point do we give consequences? Even if the kid comes back and says, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have lost my temper, but they keep happening. I find, at least in my house, the worst thing I could do is say, if you're not in that car by 7:05, you're grounded this weekend. It only makes everything worse. But so when do the consequences come in, or the positive reinforcement, to really kind of help?
So that's a really good point, because as a general rule, I do not encourage parents to use consequences when they're at the height of their own anger and frustration, because you tend to overextend. Really, what all the research shows, and I've done so much behavior management in my career, the way that you use consequences most effectively, right? And consequences are really meant to sort of curb a behavior. It's not meant to instill fear. It's meant to induce learning, right? I learned that doing it this way is just not as good for me as doing it this way. So not to use consequences when you're at the height of your own anger and frustration, because actually shorter term consequences generally work better than longer term consequences. Grounding someone for a month is super ineffective, because then they lose the meaning and attachment. So when you see that you, as a parent-child dyad, have put a plan together and the child's continually resistant to the plan, and you always start, the most behavior change happens with positive reinforcement. And we can't do a deep dive into behavior management, although maybe we should at one point, and talk about how to use positive reinforcement, because you can use small pieces of positive reinforcement in a morning routine, for example. But to always start with positive reinforcement before you start throwing out consequences.
Okay. So the positive reinforcement, instead of being like, if you're not in the car at 7:05, you're grounded. The other thing would be like, if you are in the car on time without screaming, then you're getting extra screen time tonight, or whatever that carrot is.
Exactly. So you're using that positive reinforcement, right? I would worry, like, unless that child is very, very out of the ordinary, I would not want to allow screen time in the morning, because getting them off of screen time and then transitioning them to school would be difficult. So holding that reinforcement to after school would be really effective. And then sometimes critics say, well, not all behavior is based on reinforcement. Kids just need to learn to do the right thing. And while that might be true, the reality is a lot of behavior, even adult behavior, is based on reinforcement, right? We work hard for our mid-morning coffee break, and then we work, we do work until we get a lunch break, and then we get ourselves a little special treat at lunch. Reward and reinforcement is actually an inherent part of an adult's life as well.
Okay, so as we kind of circle around and we're coming to the end of this discussion, anger, number one, is not bad, right? I mean, I've had a lot of folks being like, oh, I got angry, that was so bad. Or there's a feeling, at least especially going back generations, that you don't get angry, that's bad. And you want us to understand anger is not bad. In fact, everybody gets angry.
Everyone gets angry. I mean, everyone gets angry. Everyone's frustrated. Everyone gets sad. Everyone feels some despair at times. Hopefully we have some moments of happiness to offset it. I always say, the gold standard is just to be okay, right? That's really my goal most days. So yes, and you want to teach your children words for their feelings, right? What's anger? What's frustration? What's feeling upset? You were angry, but you were actually crying. Are you really feeling sad about something, right? So it's really having the willingness to talk about things, and often talk about what might be underneath some feelings. And anger's one where you really want to get at kind of what's underneath it.
Yeah. So do be empathetic. Do offer words. According to these new studies where they looked at lots of cases, it doesn't really help the venting, the pounding, the rage rooms. The more we do that and we increase our arousal, we might actually be just fueling the anger, giving it gas.
Right. That's a good point. We are giving it gas. We want to, engage in activities that are arousal reducing. So it does. So, and again, that's not going to be at the height of your arousal, the height of your anger. It's on the steps up. That's the way you kind of thwart the episodes getting worse.
I think I was reading in a magazine article, and this might work more for adults than kids. I'm imagining the time frame is a little longer for an adult, but that, when you're first really upset about something, sleep on it for, say, 24 hours. If it still bothers you, speak up within 48 hours, because you also don't want people just stuffing their anger and not perhaps advocating for something that they need a boundary in some situation.
Right. I mean, that's what we're talking about. There often is a skill deficit underneath, and right, it might be setting if you're holding on to anger, it might be because you're not setting boundaries, or you're not expressing yourself in situations where you need to express yourself, right? Kids that are getting bullied at school and then build that anger and kind of victim mentality builds, and then they do it to someone else. So there's often skills deficits underneath a lot of that. And I mean, that's what obviously we're trained as helping professionals. We're trained to really look at patterns of behavior and understand what the underlying skill deficits are. But really, parents have to be junior psychologists at times, and they need to understand that, boy, my child really seems like they don't have an ability to express themselves, or they don't have an ability to set a limit or express, or, talk to a friend about something direct. Instead, they just get angry and frustrated. So it's understanding the underlying skill deficit as well.
Okay, so even having patients that are kids, their brain is not fully developed. So I love the book, The Whole Brain Child, Daniel Siegel, right? Something like that. But the idea that, like, if you're getting frustrated and your kids just aren't handling things well, or your teen is going off the deep end all the time, that part of the brain, I think it's the prefrontal cortex, is one of the last things to come online. So, like, we actually might have to expect less from our kids with their ability to manage their anger and their emotions. They're still learning.
Yeah, I mean, goodness, there are some adults that don't even learn to manage their emotions, right? So yes, learning to identify and manage your emotions is part of your developmental path. And, for some people, it's not until they're in their early 20s that they truly, have an ability. And everyone's life circumstances and family environments are different. Some families are more in tune with talking about feelings and managing feelings and talking about, skills to manage feelings. And some families don't talk about any of that stuff. And so honestly, in those situations, sometimes it takes a little longer learning how to manage your emotional well-being.
So, a lot of us maybe don't want to repeat what we came from. If you came from a house where everyone yelled, or you were, someone was always getting angry at you, yet that's what you knew. So we only have 2 minutes left, so it's a big question to ask with 2 minutes left. But what do you do when that's been your pattern and you want to shift it?
Well, I worry, with those parents who are in that, like, explosive anger then regret pattern, because that's a really, really hard pattern to address. And again, it's understanding what's underneath it. It's your own, maybe it's your own, worry about your own upbringing or your own mental health issues, or, sometimes there's bigger issues. So it's really looking at that pattern for yourself and figuring out the best way to not repeat patterns. To talk to a professional if that's what you need to do to kind of thwart, generational patterns from repeating themselves, and being a little bit more graceful with yourself and not being so hard on yourself as a parent. It is the hardest job in the world.
Yeah, so, and even giving, whether it be yourself or your kids, if they're moving in the direction of keeping their cool, let's say, that's when you would really pile on some praise. Like, a couple of weeks ago, you would have gotten so angry. I saw you were about to get angry and you chose a strategy. Like, we would really want to give them credit for the effort, even if they ended up still getting angry or whatever, if it was moving in the right direction. That really helps.
Absolutely. Right. So in that situation, it might seem funny to say, you did such a good job. Yesterday, your tantrum was 7 or 8 minutes, and today it was only 2 or 3 minutes, right? That might feel like a funny kind of compliment to give, but noticing that behavior is sending the message, I'm giving you my time and attention. I've noticed this. We're not looking for perfection. We're just looking for moving in a positive direction.
Dr. Laura Saunders, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.